Right, so you are again welcome back to class. We are still in the second module, talking about the 353 of Scrum. In previous classes, we've looked at the first three, making reference to the three roles in Scrum: the Scrum Master role, the Product Owner role, and the Developer's role, or the development team members. Then, secondly, we have also looked at the 5 events in Scrum, making reference to the sprint planning, the daily Scrum, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective, making 5, right? Sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. But we also added 2 other meetings of value to those events, and that's talking about the backlog refinement, which is also called backlog grooming. Then lastly, we spoke about the parking lot meeting. If you have any question in those previous ones, if you need to go over those classes, please do. But again, if you have any questions, you can always send them across to me. So we are here at the final part of the 353, talking about the second 3. And those are the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the product increments. I want to believe by now we have some understanding of what these artifacts are. The artifacts in Scrum, they are the tangible aspects of Scrum. I term it as the tangible aspects. What could be measured, what we could relate with, right? So we have the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the product increments. We've gone through the product backlog for some time. In the first module, we discussed briefly about this, so we'll take some time to dig deeper into what this is all about. So the product backlog itself talks about the vision and the priorities. The product backlog contains all the work items needed to complete the product. Let's cast our mind back to Module 1, where we mentioned, while defining Scrum itself as a light framework that breaks complex projects or products into smaller bits, builds a cross-functional team around it, of course with a time box period talking about the sprints, and deliver those value. So picture a product backlog as the entire project or product that needs to be developed, but now broken into smaller pieces, just like a puzzle. You know those little puzzles that of course from time to time we all have played with those. We've seen younger ones play with them. Each piece of the puzzle is a part of the bigger picture. And of course, how that puzzle would have been developed in the first place was to have the bigger picture before now cutting them down into smaller bits. So that's just what the product backlog is like. The product backlog contains all the work that needs to be done. The difference between a product backlog and the product increments is that one is the start, the other is the ending, or the starting and the ending. So the product backlog contains all the work that needs to be done to achieve the products, while the increment is those work as they are being done and they are now coming together to make a whole. So just briefly, I'm sure we are more familiar with this project now. The house project, which is what we've been using for this class. Every piece of work item here would form the product backlog. We have a timeline. I've explained in previous classes what an epic is. If you need to catch up on that, you may need to check the previous classes. We could see different layers, but these are still in the bigger chunks. Approval, foundation, and all the rest, on and on. By the time each of these had been fully delivered, you would have the house at the other end. So these ones is at the higher level, cascaded down or decomposed further, and we can see the decomposition, but they were now cascaded down into the product backlog. And I explained to us in one of those classes that under Jira, where you have the backlog refers to the product backlog. At the upper side, where you have the sprint, refers to the sprint backlog. So the product backlog is where all the stories of what needs to be done were written, right? So that forms the product backlog. So the product backlog gives us a clear vision and priorities on the product that is being developed. So let's jump right into the product backlog. Okay. So this is the product backlog for those taking the product owner. Under the product owner, we will look closer at this to understand more what the role of a product owner in Scrum is. So we can see the product backlog here, listed here. And this is how they come in. The stakeholders are sending, let me get my marker. The stakeholders are sending requirements. It could come by mail, it could be by discussion. They are sending different requirements to the product owner. So this is the product owner. And all those requirements are getting stacked up on the board, forming layers of stories. But we could also see that there are different types. One that I want to make a brief emphasis on is this, that looks like a bug. And exactly that is what it is. It's a bug. Or in our own local word, it looks like a cockroach. It's called a bug, and a bug is an error that needs to be corrected, or a work that had been previously done that needs to be improved upon. So when there are errors, we write a story as a bug and stack it up on the product backlog, right? So this product backlog here is the same as what we have here. This is the electronic form of it. Before COVID happened, where everybody worked from, at least mostly everybody, of course not everybody still, worked from the sites, we had a board, a literary board, that all the stories get stacked up. And we could see from this diagram that there is always a product goal. Mind you, these are two separate pictures, right? This is one, and this is the other. So from this one, we could see different stakeholders. There is a new idea that popped up here, and it's been sent down as a requirement, right? So we could see different stakeholders sending their different requirements. So one could be from a department of sales, another could be from finance. Each one has different specific requirements that they want. But the product owner is also in charge of the product goal. Every product must have a product goal, just as I made reference earlier in previous classes that every sprint must have a sprint goal also. So the requirements would be sent directly, and that reminds me, requirements are expected in Scrum to be sent only to the product backlog. To the product backlog. That's, I need to make some emphasis on that. On the field, you could have instances which forms what we call anti-pattern in Scrum, where requirements are sent directly to the developers. Every requirement is meant to be sent to the product owner so that all the requirements could be captured on the board. The impact of that, where requirements do not go through the product owner, is that you end up having team members, developers, working on multiple tasks that is not captured, that is not visible. So it could bring some burden to the developers, but work will not be transparent enough. Mind you, the empiricism of Scrum talks about transparency, inspection, and adaptation. So, according to Scrum, all requirements should be sent to the product owner, and it should find its way written in the product backlog. So when anyone looks at the product backlog, at a quick glance, you see clearly what needs to be done, what is being done, what is left to be done. So we call a detailed product backlog, not product backlog this time, a timeline, as the product roadmap. So we refer to that as single source of truth, SST, which means a quick glance on your board brings that transparency everyone needs. And that is one of the beauty of Agile. It makes work to be so transparent. Everyone that has access to your board would be able to know progress of work without needing further explanations. All right, so that's the first picture. The second picture is similar. They are both actually, but from different angles. So we can see the product backlog stacked up. These are different work items that need to be done. And we call it product backlog items, PBI. So PBI is one of the terms you would hear of as we go further. Product backlog item, that's what it means. The items in the product backlog. There's a container called the backlog. So the items in the product backlog is the PBIs. So these are different items. However, just as I said that they have different forms of requirements, same also, this has now broken it down further to us. So the product backlog item could be features. We call something functional stories. It could be defects. Defect makes reference to the bug. It could be technical work. It could also be knowledge acquisition. That means learning. So you could write stories as learning for personal development and add it to your product backlog. So it becomes a doable task for you. So everything comes into the product backlog. When we get to the product owner end, we will discuss further on this, the user stories, the use cases, and free-form tests. There are ways of writing product backlog. I mentioned the user story earlier when we were looking at sprint planning and backlog refinement. So just note that the product backlog contains product backlog items. All the work that needs to be done to deliver a functional product is the product backlog itself. So let's go further. All right, so the product backlog. What is the product backlog? We've explained that. A list of all items that need to be completed. Those items could be functional, could be specifications, could be corrections, which is bug that needs to be fixed, could be development plan for learning, could be anything you need to that will come together to make the final product finds itself in the product backlog. And this is the direction. There is a vision from the stakeholder, but the vision is broken down into epics. Let's see that in just a bit. The vision here would be the house project. The house project itself is now broken down into epics. At this level, we would limit this conversation to epics, from vision to epics. There are higher levels in organizations aside epics. We have initiatives and we have capabilities in Jira, but we limit these conversations to only epics. So the vision itself, house project, is now broken into bigger chunks or bigger components. Approval, foundation, block wall, roofing. Of course, each of these has its own smaller pieces that will come together. Roofing, for instance. Each of these also could be broken further, but for the sake of what we're working on now, just note that the vision itself is broken into epics. And of course, epics could be broken into functions as it could be required. Epics could be broken into functions where you want to put functionalities together and deliver them. For instance, there's what we call the customer journey for a software as an illustration. So in that customer journey, we would have the login journey. So that login journey is one function, but there are now different stories that would come together to form the function, whereas this function is a piece in epic. And of course, we saw from the board where you now create tasks as stories. But what we have in this board, we do not have function here. Different organizations actually develop it as they would drive value from. So that is why it comes differently like this. So in some organizations, you may not have function here. In some you could. But note that epic is one of the important piece. The user stories is also important. Then, of course, a user story could be broken down further into tasks. Let me show you that to us again. I think we wrote a story somewhere. Which story was that? I'm not sure if it is this project. Okay, yeah. So we can see from here, under survey, we have measurements as task. We have pegging as task. So we have the epic approver. We have the user story survey. We have the task, measurements, and pegging. The same as what we have here. So all this is what we make reference to as decomposition. By breaking down the big projects or products into smaller bits and ensuring that each of those stories, while we were talking about sprint planning and backlog refinements, we made reference to the invest criteria. So while you are decomposing, you are also ensuring that each story carries the detail needed. Each story carries the details needed, right? Then, of course, each of these under the product backlog, there should be an alignment with the roadmap and a delivery timeline. Every product, every stakeholder wants to have an idea, when will it be done? When will it be ready? So for your product backlog, there should be an alignment with the roadmap. I told us sometimes back, this is what the roadmap looks like. If we could decide, for instance, to put a timeline here. You can see the different timelines. This is just for class reference. So this shows us when this approval would be ready. It's flexible. Anything in Agile is always flexible. It's adaptable. So this also could be moved. So this is what we make reference to as the timeline. When will it be delivered? When would each of the piece be delivered? That's what it means. You could see the flag in here. Child issue begins and ends, begin and end outside the date set for this parent issue. How could you finish the parents? The parent is the approval before the work inside would be accomplished. That's why this has been flagged. If we pull this timeline further, you see that flagging is gone. But just for the knowledge and the understanding, when you get to the practicals, you'll be able to see clearly how all this information come together. So note that your products and product backlog should have some understanding of the delivery timeline, and also should have, where is the board now? Okay, and it should also align with the roadmap. I wanted to add earlier that each piece as a child belongs to a parent, that also belongs to a parent, that would eventually belong to the great grandfather or the parent of all. So that is the decomposition and the breakdown. A good board, where you have a good scrum master with a team and a product owner, each piece of task that needs to be accomplished should belong to a parent. No child should be an orphan. So the product owner should have a clear understanding that every task should be a child to a parent. But where that is not, I made mention at the beginning of the class that the Scrum Master is the epitome of Scrum. So your role is to be guiding and supporting the product owner. So you have to ensure also that each child or each task belongs to a parent. So there will now end up being an alignment all the way up, down. We've mentioned about appropriate detailing and product goal. Appropriate detailing, each story in your product backlog should be detailed appropriately. And we have 2 meetings or events you can take advantage of to have appropriate detailing. The first one is backlog grooming, where you plan ahead of the sprint and add the needed detail. The essence of detailing appropriately is so that any developer that needs to work on each of those stories has a clear understanding what they need to work on, without needing to call, product owner, what do I need to do here? So each story should be detailed appropriately. And I mentioned also earlier that each product should have a goal, just as each sprint should have a goal. Then also the high-level prioritization, which was what we looked at in the previous class. We looked at that also. Under the timeline, we saw from here that there is no way you could begin to plan for plastering when you've not delivered approval or foundation. What are you plastering without the foundation? So this is the high level. The high level is talking about the bigger blocks, the epics, the functions beyond just the stories. Excuse me. Beyond just the stories. It's talking about the bigger chunks. So there should be high level prioritization where per time the team knows that in the next 2 sprints we would focus on foundation, and after 2 weeks when we deliver foundation we are going into block work. It's a layer that is being built, layer to layer. Then lastly here, as it relates to definition of ready, we've discussed definition of ready when we were discussing sprint planning. And definition of ready is where each of the story is ready to sprint. And ready to sprint means all that is needed to deliver that story is available for the team to deliver. Meaning each of the story meets invest criteria. If you need to go again on that class, looking at sprint planning and backlog requirements, please do that. Each of those story meets the invest criteria, and the team has the right velocity that can accommodate it. The team has capacity to deliver that work in that sprint. Capacity talking about the skill set. The team has availability to work on that story in the sprint. Availability, which means there is a developer that can accommodate that work within that sprint. So all this come together to meet the definition of ready. If you need to have a quick catch up on definition of ready, please go again to the sprint planning and the backlog requirements classes that we took earlier. All right, I think that's pretty everything about the backlog, the product backlog. So as a quick recap, the product backlog itself is all requirements streaming in from different stakeholders, and I emphasize through the product owner. If you need to have a quick catch up on who a product owner again is, please check the class on the product owner. At no time should requirement be sent directly to the developer. Every one of it should go through the product owner and should end up on the board. The board gives us that visibility. So the entire big block is broken into smaller pieces and it's populated to the board and made visible. And I also explained that it could be features or defects, a problem that needs to be fixed. It could be technical work, and it could be knowledge acquisition also. All right, so that will be all for this class. If you have any questions, please note them down and send them across to me. We'll have some time to catch up on them. See you in the next class.